Welcome to our HQ Live. I'm so excited. We have Chris Sousa here today with us. He's one of our Handi Quilter educators. And Chris, first of all, maybe you could just tell us what got you involved in quilting?
You know, it's a little different. Being a male quilter, they tell us that there's a lot of male quilters, but you know, there aren't that many per se. So my wife, I wanted to make her a gift. So I learned how to quilt by making my first quilt, which was a king-size kaleidoscope pinwheel. The interesting thing about being a male quilter, most of them have their wives or significant others that are quilters, and my wife doesn't sew.
So you didn't pick a real easy quilt to start with, Chris. No one told you that might be hard, I guess. So.
You know, I guess that's the simplicity of it, that I just don't do anything small.
Good for you. So what we're going to go over today, and we're just really lucky to have Chris with us, and he does such a fabulous job explaining things. And we're going to talk about thread, needles, and tension, and just building confidence in establishing a good tension for yourselves at home. So, and also like choosing the right needle and the right thread. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of Chris's favorite threads. And that's where we're going to go from there.
Fantastic.
So really quickly, I want to tell them about the quilts behind us on the wall. These were just sampler quilts made by the educators at Handi Quilter back in 2012. And we chose these to hang behind us today because there's a lot of fantastic use of threads, whether they were doing micro quilting or changing thread colors because of the fabric choices. But we chose those specifically because of the thread that was used in these quilts behind us. So
they're a fantastic example.
So let's start off, Chris, by having you talk about how do you decide what thread to use on your quilt?
You know, the importance to the thread in the quilt is when I'm putting a design on a quilt, it is my opinion that the thread should complement the quilt. It shouldn't be the first thing you see when you look at a quilt. It should be the design of the quilt and the piecing. So your choice of threads can make a real difference in how the quilt is perceived along with your designs. So what I do is I try to look for an element in the quilt for a color. So on this quilt, for example, we've got some purples. We've got some very busy fabrics that have some purple in it. So I look at it, and the color that was used on this was a yellow to tie in the golds and the yellows. And you can see how it shows on all of the darker colors. Right. So for me, I preferred, for myself, I would use a purple. Now some people would say, why a purple?
Interesting thread choice.
So the reason I choose purple is because if you look, as it goes over the lights and the darks, it doesn't get really big change of value. So on the light colors, it doesn't get too dark. On the dark colors, it doesn't get too light. And it ties in the rest of the purples into the quilt. So I kind of think out of the box. I've got about 6 colors that I kind of focus on as blenders. And a purple in this shade is one of those colors.
So I've always gone with this theory too, Chris, but I have never used purple as a blender. So thank you for adding that to my quilting.
And
I love that.
It is one of my primary colors that I have a general go-to.
It's just amazing how the orange soaks in the purple. It doesn't, I mean, it just doesn't stand out as it shouldn't be there. Same with purple, the bright orange, the purple just kind of blends everywhere.
I enjoy it.
I love that choice.
The other thing is, sometimes with a busy fabric, some people try to choose like a variegated thread. My own personal choice is it doesn't really add to the quilt. You lose the variegated thread, and it is usually a more expensive thread to have a variegation.
Yes, you're right, it is.
So you lose the variegation. If I had a large negative area, I would probably use the variegation to cover that.
Right. Let's go back really quickly. I would like to talk more about variegated, but I'd love for you to show me like some more of what your blender colors are. Show me more about blending threads, because we run into this problem a lot where you'll have like a navy blue and a white quilt or
also the thing,
something like that.
That's fantastic. The thing I also caution against is using the cone to look at your color, because that
Good point.
saturation may not, you won't see how it's going to blend without debuting the threads.
Right.
So I pull them out.
So I don't know if we pointed that out very much, but when Chris was auditioning the thread, he pulled it out and laid a strand of thread across all the colors in the quilt so that you can see what it does. So
Another one of my
It's a good
favorites
point.
for blenders is almost like an off green, like a celery green. This is similar to the colors that I use. Now, as I debut that over,
okay, truthfully, if I picked this thread up off the shelf, I would not be able to think of a quilt I could use it in.
and
But looking at what you've done with it on the quilt, I'm like, another one I need to add to my quilting room.
And as we look at this, you can see the changes of color actually. It doesn't look really green. I mean, it's beside the gold
No,
thread
it doesn't.
here. On the black, it looks almost gold, whereas on other colors, it will change back to its green. It doesn't have to be the exact shade of green that's in your quilt for it to blend. I choose this one also because it doesn't change value. My
Okay.
blender threads that I choose are because they don't change value
Okay.
from light to dark, meaning it doesn't get too light on the dark, it doesn't get too dark on the light. So therefore, it blends with the whole quilt.
That's a perfect explanation. I love that. Okay, show me some of your other favorite colors.
So, other than that, I have a gold that I like to use. Similar to this is, and I would use this same type of gold. What this does is it will tie certain things in. But on this particular quilt, it's not my go-to on this because it is a little bright and it gets a little lost in your yellows and oranges.
Okay.
When that happens, you lose continuity. If your eyes don't have any place to go, they get lost.
So can you think of maybe, are we talking like the traditional, the navy, the mauve? Is that the type of colors you would put this on? What?
You know, I actually use that a lot on my Christmas quilts,
Oh,
holiday quilts that have, especially Christmas or
Okay.
you know, the Christmas season quilts. The gold works really well. It ties in a lot of the metallic designs that you see, the inks that they're using on a lot of those.
when you use a trilobal poly like this, it almost looks like a metallic, doesn't it?
It
When you
shines
quilt it, yeah.
because of the way that the thread is designed and made in three pyramids.
Okay. What? Tell me that again. The three pyramids. Tell
okay.
me. Are you talking about the trilobal poly?
Trilobal polyester,
Okay.
the importance in how your thread looks, and that comes in thread selection. Are you looking for something that's very bright? Are you looking for something that's going to shine? Trilobal polyester is basically made three strands that are basically like a pyramid.
Right.
What happens is the light goes in, and like a prism, it shines out really bright. It doesn't get lost like a normal round thread would. So if you want to use something bright, you can use a trilobal polyester.
I like that explanation. Good.
One of the other colors that I really like is a silver. So this is So Fine from
Okay.
Superior. This is 408. So obviously, it's not something that I would use on this quilt. But if you look next to the purple, it almost turns purple and blue.
Yes, it does.
So it does change. It's just a little too bright for this quilt, and there's really not a lot of silver in here. But I use that on a lot of my Halloween quilts.
Uh-huh.
I've done a lot of Spider-Man quilts because I have a grandson that loves Spider-Man. So I use that in spider webs and things that I'd want silver. I also use this in my holiday quilts. You mentioned the blues and things like that. That's where this comes in. I will use my silver on the blues. And
I use it even on like black and white, because if I quilted with black thread on the white, it's really unforgiving. It just, the black thread really stands out. If I quilt white, it stands out on the
it does.
black. So if I use something medium like gray, that's where I choose to use it, is because, like you say, it blends. It blends evenly on both of those colors. So.
It does. And I will tell you, even though purple was not your go-to, I did a recent black and white background quilt that I did with the purple.
Purple's
it
my
came-
favorite
it came
color, so
came out beautiful.
I'm going to try that.
So one of the other colors is a taupish kind of.
Yes.
And I will use this a lot of times because it will blend in, therefore why I use blender threads.
Yeah.
So, you know, other than my standard white, this is another color that I use a lot of.
Okay. I'm with you. I use that color a lot on probably those traditional colored fabrics I was talking about. So
The key is to make sure that you're debuting your threads on the quilt. You know, if I have a quilt top that comes in, this is how I'm going to do it. I'm going to lay the quilt top down. And I've had customers and people that have said, oh, I don't like green. But I've laid out the green thread. Out of all the threads, they picked that one.
because it
So
blends the best.
It's not a matter of what somebody thinks may be the best. You try to find exactly what would work.
Okay.
It's what's pleasing to the eye.
It really helps a lot to be able to audition your thread, or you called it debuting your thread, laying it across the fabric like that. So awesome. Are those your most used? Do you ever use yellow as a blender?
You know, I do have a yellow. I wouldn't necessarily call it a blender, but I use
Okay.
it with a quilt that may have a little bit of yellow or whites and yellows.
Okay.
I will use, SoFine has one 419. So it's a softer, almost lemony kind of chiffon, and this kind of fades right in. It works really well. Now
Yeah.
the nice thing is you can get threads for your long arm that are in spools. You don't always have to have cones. So
Right.
if you're using a small amount of thread or only need a small amount, you can work with them on your long arm. Some people don't realize that, but you do not want to have them setting this way.
So thread delivery is a big factor.
It is, but
Okay.
you can do that using your horizontal spool pin.
Okay.
So when you set up your horizontal spool pin, your spool would go on like this, and it would continue.
Hold that for you.
There you go.
Okay.
And that would allow the thread to come off as it was wound on, because there's
Okay.
two different ways that threads are wound. They're either wound onto the spool in a stack wind, or they're cross wound.
Right.
When you look at how your cones are wound, you can see that they're cross wound. These are made to come off coming off the top. Those are made to come off the side.
You're right. Okay, I want to point out really quickly on the horizontal spool pin the appropriate way that it should be on your post. So if you have this correctly on your post, this thumb screw should be behind the post so that it's not impeding the movement of the spool.
Because that will change your tension.
Yeah, so when you put, I'm going to move it around so you can see it on all sides. The thumb screw should be behind the straight, the vertical, or what's the post, the
Your
straight
vertical
up-
post.
the vertical post, so that it just doesn't get in the way of that spinning.
With a slight angle going up so
Yes.
the spool doesn't come off.
Yeah, we don't want to tilt it down or you'll lose that spool, so we'll just tilt it up just a tiny bit. So just wanted to make sure you knew how that went on there.
So,
Okay. So I
horizontal
like
spool
that
pin.
explanation for the horizontal spool pin.
And I find it important because there's a lot of specialty threads like your glitter threads and your metallics that you're not going to necessarily buy in a very large cone.
Right.
So that is one of the tools that I automatically, when people are asking me what I need for my long arm, right off the bat, the first thing I'm saying is, okay, you need a glide foot, you need to have your horizontal spool pin,
Okay.
and if you're going to do rulers, your Surefoot.
So as long as you have a high quality thread, the spools are fantastic. Just make sure that you understand that thread delivery system can be a factor. So
And you know, that being said, I like how you said that, the high quality threads. You know, what people have to understand is that even if you bought the most expensive thread on the market, it's still the cheapest thing you're going to put in the quilt.
right.
So why not use a top quality thread? It's going to give you better delivery and a better quality product. And you've spent many hours putting this quilt together, or somebody has.
Yes.
You've spent quite a bit of money putting this quilt together. Why put it together with a poor quality thread that's going to take away from it?
Exactly. That's a good point. All right. let's talk about, well, we briefly talked about variegated. I'd like to talk about it just a little bit more. I kind of interrupted you. I apologize
It's okay.
for that. But variegated's it's a favorite for people. People love variegated thread, and they love it because it's so beautiful. It's just got so many different colors. But what kind of a quilt? Like, where should I, you said purple. Should I put purple variegated on this quilt?
You know, when I look at a quilt, especially when I'm looking at variegated threads, I'm looking for something with a lot of negative space where the variegated can show.
Okay.
Now, it doesn't mean you have to have it in the bobbin and in the top. I will use, if I were using this particular thread, I could use this as my bobbin thread because it is one of the colors within the variegation. That way you're not using your variegated threads, which can be more expensive in both your bottom and top thread.
Well, and the chance of matching up the color in the variegation,
Your chances of ever getting that to happen properly
it's
is
just
going to
really
be slim
not
and
very
none.
good. Yeah.
But on a quilt like this, even if we had a gold and orange variegated thread, you're going to lose the effects of the variegation. So I try to make sure that I've got a lot of negative space or something that my design is going to highlight that thread. Because the biggest disappointment some people have is they'll have something like this particular fabric, they'll pick something that has all these colors in it,
Yeah.
they use a bunch of variegated thread and then they look at it and go, I can't see the thread.
It's so
And
disappointing.
you don't want to lose it.
When
you don't want to lose your thread.
Yeah. Well, and I like what you said in the beginning, that your quilting is just really to finish the quilt and enhance the piecing, if at all possible, not to take the show. So when I choose a variegated thread, I want it to be in a place where it can be a part of the show. So I have to be careful about where I'm putting it because I really want those colors, those beautiful combined colors, to be able to stand out somewhere. So.
And for me, I'm always trying to find design elements that are going to enhance that. But you also have to make sure that you're taking into account, does this really benefit the quilt, or am I just trying to,
Good
have some fun with the thread?
Good point. Sometimes I forget
You
that.
can do a
rule.
whole cloth quilt on a blank piece of fabric and have a blast with a lot of the variegated threads.
Oh, that'd be a good place to do it.
It would be.
Yeah. All right, let's talk about specialty threads. Do you have some specialty threads that you love to use or like to add occasionally to those special places?
There are times that I will use a metallic.
Okay.
Because there's times metallic threads can really jump out. So if you put a metallic down, you can see how it just shines. If I've got elements that I want to see, I can shine these with that. It would show up pretty much everywhere.
Yes, it would.
I wouldn't want to use it for my edge-to-edge design on the whole quilt, but I would want to highlight things with the metallic thread.
Okay.
You also just want to make sure that you're using the proper needle. And on a metallic thread, I generally wouldn't put metallic in the bobbin. I would generally use a base thread of maybe a beige or maybe something that's a little neutral so it's not going to show.
Okay, we'll talk about winding a bobbin and why this would be a little tricky winding a bobbin in just a minute. But
You bet.
yeah, I love having a place to kind of highlight some threads sometimes, and metallic is one of my favorites.
Now you also have the glitter threads, which these can be a lot of fun. But this is, again, something you're going to want your horizontal spool pin for.
Yes.
And as you're looking at that, these glitter threads, I'd want to run a little slower,
Okay.
a little less tension. You've got to be careful on it because it is basically easy to stretch. So
Yeah.
you'd want to run less tension.
I also like to use a bigger stitch because then it leaves more of the thread sitting on top of the fabric. So I like bigger stitches when I'm going to use a specialty thread like that. So
I generally sit 8 to 10 stitches per inch when I'm working with some of my specialty threads. When you try to put it too tight, sometimes you have a tendency to have a thread break, or if you're trying to go too fast or too many changes.
awesome. This is fun. Okay, let's talk about needles, because do you just put one needle in and leave it, or How are we matching up the needle, the thread, that kind of thing?
The importance that I find with our needles are just as important as our threads. They have to be matched. So we want to make sure we use the proper size for our needles. We do have a chart that is set here where it sets our needle size against silk thread, which is a 100-weight thread, or our micro quilter threads that are 100-weight polyester thread. You know, you can use it for a 60-weight, your monofilament, which would be like your monopoly, the thinner cotton and mylar threads, which would be similar to the glitter thread that we just showed. We also have the 14, the 16, the 18, and the 20. And next to each one of those tells you what threads it works well with.
So where do I find this guide?
This guide is included with your machine.
Okay.
It is on our website.
Okay.
It is also on the newer generation machines. It's actually part of a screen that you can go in and find it.
Isn't that amazing?
It is. And
the little information screen.
And that
little
information,
eye, yeah, it shows you.
When you are doing it on the Amara and the Forte and the Infinity, it also gives you, if you have trouble wondering thread path and things like that, it gives you your complete threading guide from there also.
It's fantastic.
So it does work out well.
Yeah.
But with your needles, you also want to make sure you're using the proper needles.
Okay.
So when you look on the needles, you can see your size, which is up in the top right-hand corner. So
the one I'm holding right now says 110/18. So the number we usually use is 18, but you'll occasionally hear people using the 110 or the 100 or.
And that is because there are two different worlds of needle sizing. It's just important, if you're working with an 18, they're always going to be just like that.
Yeah.
We use the Gross-Beckert needles. They are made wonderfully. They're high quality needle. And if you look at that, it's also a 134 series needle.
That's one more thing to see on there, is make sure that you're getting the system 134.
Correct.
Yeah.
Because if you're not all needles are equal, and not all needles will work. So
well, some are longer, some are shorter.
It has to do with
system.
the makeup of the needle and the particular unit that you're putting it on. For all of our machines, that's what we use. And you know, I generally, for two needles that I keep a pretty good number of, I keep 16s and 18s, because those primarily cover the thread sizes I use.
So a question that we are often asked is, so if I'm going to quilt on like a denim quilt, what kind of needle do I use? Because on our domestic machines, right, we have needles for denim, we have needles for stretch, we have needles for sharp. So the question is, if I'm quilting a denim quilt, what size needle do I use? What's your answer, Chris?
Well, the size of the needle isn't, for me, is not on the item that I'm quilting. I mean, denim is basically cotton, but I'm going towards my thread size. So what thread size am I using?
Okay, so that's what we focus on with the Longarm, is what kind of thread are we using rather than what type of fabric is. That's not our first question. Our first question is what type of thread, right?
What size thread am I using? And then I can go to my needle size to correspond with that thread size. You know, whether I'm using a 40 weight or a 50 weight or a 60 weight. Of course, hopefully everybody understands, as you go up in thread weight size, you're going thinner thread. It's the opposite with needles. As you're going up in sizes of needles, you're going bigger.
They wanted to keep us on our toes. So remember that.
The
higher the number for the thread weight, the finer the thread.
Correct.
So the higher number of needle, it actually is a bigger hole. So to get a finer needle, you need a smaller number. So
and you know, there's conflicting. We have ballpoint needles now, and there are conflicting ideas on whether the ballpoint needles. I would use a ballpoint on denim because it would be the same thing that the denim needles on my standard machine.
Okay.
So I would still use it for whatever size thread, but I would use the ballpoint.
And I like the ballpoint when I'm stitching t-shirts, or I still go back to the knit thing. So if I'm stitching on soft cuddle or
I use
that
it
kind of
also
knit.
for my batiks because batiks being a tighter weave fabric,
Yes.
it doesn't slice through any of the fibers.
Okay.
It'll
I've
push
heard
'em aside.
people say they have better luck with those on the batik.
I have,
so,
and sometimes if you notice that if you're skipping a stitch or two once in a while,
yeah.
go up in a size needle.
So we're not telling you what you're doing is wrong, but if
Nope.
you're struggling with any of these types of things, you can try something
There-
like that.
There's
and
always
see.
a way to,
Yeah.
try to remedy the situation.
Right. So, good, good, good. Okay, so I think we covered needles pretty well. Let's talk about tension, setting
Okay.
our tension. And let's start with the bobbin because that's
Okay.
where we start with our machines is the bobbin's our foundation of the tension.
So when you're setting your tension on your bobbin, you should always set it the same all the time
Okay,
because your bobbin tension should be the same. The only tension you should ever have to adjust is your top tension once your bobbin is set.
right, okay,
So a lot of people will do the drop test and see if it lifts up in their hand.
I'm a drop tester.
And that works fine. For me, I personally use a TOA gauge. The reason I use a TOA gauge is because using that gauge gives me a set point to look at, but that comes from being kind of scientific in the way that I look at things.
It's good, and then there's
It's
more
just
than
another way to do
one
things.
way to do things, and so we wanted Chris to talk about the TOA gauge and show us how that works for you, because I'm a drop tester, but I'd like to,
So the reason I use a TOA gauge, which is this is a TM3, which is the size for M-class bobbins, which is what we use in our long arm.
okay,
The reason I use it is because when the bobbin goes into it, you're engaging your backlash spring.
okay,
So therefore, by engaging your backlash spring, it is actually the true tension of what it's going to be in the machine. So it just goes under that wheel, over that wheel, and you give it a pull. Now, not slow, trying to make the number, but you give it a good pull. And as we do that, we're noticing it's at 170. So that needle, as it rises, as I pull this, it's ending up around here.
okay, is your number going to be the same as mine?
You know, tension is always an arbitrary number.
Okay,
So it's what you like. For me, my machines run really well at 170. So
Okay.
all my machines, no matter whether it has been an Avante or an Amara or a Forte or a Fusion or my Infinity, I have set mine at 170.
okay, let me just get this straight though.
Go ahead.
If I pull this similarly to the way you did, it should be about 170 because that's showing me the tightness.
It's
Is that right?
Exactly.
So I am getting
You're getting exactly what the number is.
150 to 170. There you go.
So for me,
So you're setting that according to how your machine, where you get the best tension on your machine.
some people like their tensions to be tighter, some people like them to be looser. And that's the really exciting thing about quilting is that there's no one way. There's no right way, wrong way. There's many ways to get to our completed item, whether it's a quilt, whether it's a table runner. For me, I like mine to look a little bit more traditional. I don't like a super tight stitch.
Okay.
If I wanted it super tight, I could set this tighter, but then I'm setting my top tension tighter.
Okay.
Because tension is a tug of
It's
war.
tug of war, yeah.
So for me, I have found that I get the best quality and the best tension out of my machines at 170. And no matter what machine I've run, I have set it for that.
Okay.
And then I will adjust my top tension because once your bobbin tension is set, and this is for all of my threads, if I'm working, this is a 50 weight so fine that's in this bobbin. If I'm doing a 40 weight, I still set my bobbin tension at 170.
Okay.
So no matter what I'm working with, I set my tension at the exact same because the only tension I want to have to adjust is my top tension.
I like that theory. It's so much easier to just have to make adjustments on that upper tension knob than to have to pull out your bobbin and keep changing it. So that's pretty much the rule of thumb on a long arm machine is set your bobbin tension at your ideal setting, put it in the machine, and then stop thinking about the bobbin, and now we'll focus on the upper tension.
Correct. So if you look at your tension, if your top thread's being pulled through to the bottom, your top tension is too loose.
Okay.
If your top tension is being pulled through, or your bobbin tension, your bobbin thread's being pulled through the top, your top tension's too tight. It's pulling that up. When I do my quilts, kind of a trick that I like to do, because how many times has anybody quilted a pass and their top looks perfect, but when they roll the quilt, they see the tension on the back may not have been all that great?
That's happened to me.
So personally, for me, I did 400 quilts last year, so I do quite a few, and most of them are edge to edge. What I try to do is when my stitch is being made, I try to actually see the stitch being made a little bit from the top.
Okay.
I don't want to see it straight lined, I don't want to see it being pulled all the way, but if I can at least see where that stitch is being made, I know that my back is perfect.
Yeah.
And that's the first thing people are going to look at.
You want to see a nice, well-formed stitch.
Correct.
And I like to think about the job of the upper thread is to go down to the bottom, you know, because of the friction, it leaves that loop. The hook passes it, and the job of the upper thread is to pull the bobbin tension up into place, which the place is in the middle of the quilt. So you got to think about what the top thread's job is, what it needs to do to finish its job. Is it pulling too tight, or is it not pulling enough to bring it up into the middle there? So
Excellent.
so upper tension, once you can think through the process of setting your bobbin, leaving it there, not touching it, it's pretty simple to just go to the top and make those adjustments. While we're talking about it, tell me how you turn, because when we're adjusting our bobbin, how much turn do we give to that little screw?
So I like to teach people in minutes.
Okay.
So a very small adjustment on that screw on your bobbin case is going to make a huge difference.
So like a tick on a clock, like
That's it, just
1 minute
1
on a
minute
clock.
at a time.
Okay.
And make small adjustments.
Okay. What about the upper?
Now the upper, because we don't have numbers on the dial, sometimes it's a matter of a quarter of a turn,
Okay.
half turn. It depends on how your thread's coming through.
Do you have any hints to help people figure out like a quarter turn? Because I know there is a little black dot on that knob, but you can't really see it.
Well, generally what I do is I just hold my thumb in one spot or a finger, and when that gets to one point,
Turn it a quarter or
I
turn
know
it a half.
where it is. I'm using my fingers or a reference point.
Okay.
So, you know, it works really well when I do that. So
Yeah.
if I take it and I put my thumb here and I rotate that up, it's a quarter of a turn.
Yeah, you'll have a lot more confidence in turning that knob if you're keeping track of how far you're turning it rather than just randomly turning it.
Because
so.
if you don't, what you're going to end up with is a lot of random spins of that dial, and then it becomes tension roulette.
Yeah,
And it's why we try to teach people, and like I try to teach my students, if you use a gauge, I can understand where you're at. Because
Yeah.
all the gauges are the same. So the tension is, when you pull it, if you're pulling it the same way I do, or with a good pull, doesn't have to be the exact same way I do, but
Yeah.
if you pull it with a good pull, like you did, you're getting the same number. So if you're having a tension issue and you call me and you say, I'm having a real problem with my tension, and I say, what's your tension at? You can tell me, oh, it's good, but if you tell me it's at 120, I can say, well, from the picture I see, raise your tension to 180
yeah.
and see how it levels out.
Talking about the TOA guide, right?
Correct.
So, yeah, it's a really good tool to be able to use and for people to have a visual of that number if that's something that's beneficial to them. I've always gone, I'm really tactile, and so I really like the drop method. But for a lot of people, the TOA guide is a perfect tool to help them walk through that bobbin tension process. So
I have had an instance where a person had told me their tension was perfect, and when they brought me their bobbin, because they couldn't figure out why the thread was being pulled through, no matter what they did to the top tension, and I put it on the TOA gauge and it went over 400. Yeah, I like to have something that looks a little,
it's nice to have that
gives
number.
me a number even though it's an arbitrary number.
Yeah, yeah. Chris, thank you so much for coming and
Thank you.
doing
I
this with
appreciate you
us.
having me.
I love the way that you explain things. He's very analytical and explains things well, and we're just happy to have you a part of Handi Quilter.
You know, and I love it. I love quilting to no end. So I enjoy being with the students and the people
Yeah.
and trying to help.
thanks for sharing your story about your first quilt. That's
Thank
pretty,
you.
it's pretty inspiring. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
If you've liked our video, please share it with people that this could benefit them for their attention and their thread choice. Subscribe to our YouTube channel so that you can follow these educational videos that we're doing. And most of all, just have some fun quilting.